It's my real pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Karin Hess, who's a recognized international leader in developing practical approaches for using cognitive rigor and learning progressions as the foundation for formative, interim, and performance learning and assessment. This comes from her website, which really does such a beautiful job of explaining what Karin has done in her past experiences as a state director of gifted education in New Jersey, as a district curriculum director, building principal, and a classroom teacher with 15 years experience. All of this enable her to understand the practical implications of this work while maintaining the fidelity for research, technical quality, and best practice. So I mentioned at dinner, I was like, this is a group of folks who really want to know, how do you do this? What does this look like on the ground? And you're going to be in for a treat tonight because we will get some of that practical approach. Karin's support for competency-based education has included guiding the development of New Hampshire's K-12 model competencies for English language arts, mathematics, and science, and supporting school districts in many states. Over dinner, we were talking about a small school district in Ohio that was so small that she had to stay in West Virginia because there wasn't a hotel. I know those places. I'm from Ohio. Her work in Wyoming, and now her work and presentation here in Montana with us tonight. It is my very great honor. Please put our hands together to welcome Dr. Karin Hess.
Thank you. I was telling Chris that there's only a few states I haven't been to yet. This is like my bucket list. And so this is sort of my first, I've flown into Billings and then driven to Wyoming. That doesn't count, right? So I'm delighted to be here. I was excited to plan the presentations and to hear a little bit about what you are all doing and to see my old friend, well, she's not as old as I am, Marie Alcott, who we go back many years and we found out we actually have New Jersey connections that we didn't know about. So that's exciting. It's exciting to know that you have the huckleberry as your state fruit now. I think you should put those fourth graders on the bus, send them to Washington, D.C. Maybe they could actually get some legislation through. They seem like pretty motivated. This is where I live. This is a picture of my hometown in Vermont. And you can't see it real well, but my house is right here. And I'm standing on top of Mount Mansfield, which is in my town. But there's not a lot of people in my town. And you can kind of see why it's the Green Mountain State, because probably all you can really see there is green. Over the years, my professional work has focused on rigor, deeper thinking. As a teacher, I took one course in differentiated learning. And I started thinking, well, I'm a regular classroom teacher. I bet I could do this here. It was supposed to be for gifted kids. Every course I took, up through getting a master's degree in teaching the gifted, I used those strategies with all of my students in all of my classes. And in my writing, I've written about how school groups, this is like an early action research book. It was one of the first books that I wrote about making change in the system. I took the idea of depth of knowledge and Bloom's taxonomy. A lot of people know that of my work. And in using that book with schools developing competency-based assessments, I felt I needed another book that was more specific to that. And my most recent book is more around the instructional strategies that lead up to it. Here's the little secret about this. You can't change one thing. When you change one thing, it's like the gears on the book. You start to move one gear and then something else has to change. So as I speak with you tonight and tomorrow, and Marie and I will do a little panel, feel free to ask questions. We don't always have the answers. Often we learn best from working through it with schools that we're working with. A little overview. I'm going to give a quick history of why and how this proficiency-based education has evolved across the country. I'm going to share a little bit of research and some lessons learned. And I'm going to let you hear and see a few examples of how schools and states are approaching this. There are some terms, just want to, if you're sort of new to this, you'll come across these terms. Proficiency and competency really pretty much mean the same thing. So if you're reading a paper on competency-based something and another on proficiency-based something, I've worked with Rhode Island when they developed their proficiency-based graduation requirements, and with New Hampshire when they developed their competency-based graduation requirements. Those words are interchangeable. You'll also hear the word mastery. I tend to stay away from it because in different places it means something a little bit different. Sometimes it means something beyond proficient. Now you've mastered it and you can go beyond. And others, it means more of what proficiency is. So those are some terms you'll hear. Choice and voice. We hear choice and voice. They're not the same. Choice is you can choose how you're going to show your learning. Choice is we're all going to read the same text, but you can choose who you want to work with and how you want to develop your ideas. Voice is, what did you learn from this learning experience? What kind of an impact has it had on you to study a region of the country? They're both important. And when we talk about personalization, personalization isn't just choice. It's also asking kids to reflect on their learning. You might hear the phrase body of work. A body of work is a prioritized collection of what students have produced. It's not everything they've produced. There's a lot. I used to carry those shopping bags home from school with papers in them. You know, I'd carry them home and I'd say, as soon as I put the kids to bed, I'll correct these papers. And then I'd carry those bags back home, back to school, and I'd put more paper in, and pretty soon I just need bigger bags, right? Because every single piece of paper, I thought, as a new teacher, you had to look at every one, you had to write something on it. And over the years, I've realized that, one, kids can give each other feedback on work, and they actually learn from doing that. Kids can select pieces of their work that they want to, as a demonstration. They want to be able to redo something because they know they can do it better. That's part of the philosophy behind proficiency-based. Keep working at it till you get it. And it doesn't mean we're going to average all of the mistakes you made with all of the good things you've actually learned. So a little bit of the research. Why is deeper learning, and I can't not talk about deep learning. We could talk about surface learning. That's the kind of learning I did when I went to school. Deep learning is kids know it at a different level. So a colleague of mine and I were asked to do a research synthesis of what college and career readiness demands of all students who are going on not just to college, but career readiness, work readiness. And what we found were there are three kind of chunks of information and skills that kids need. The first is all kids need the opportunity to work on complex tasks. They need to struggle a little bit. Productive struggle is what learning is about. They build schemas of what is mathematics, what is science, what is history, what is civics, what are the arts. Every content domain has its own schema. And if you don't take it apart and allow kids to think critically, communicate their ideas, they're never going to build those schemas. The way the brain works is, if I have a schema for mathematics, it's probably not going to help me to analyze a piece of literature. I need that schema. I need to build multiple schemas. And when we ask kids to start to take things apart, understand how the parts fit together, and change it, and make it new, make it their own, that's when learning is really happening. That's when we're testing them on what they've learned, not on what they memorized. That's the first skill set. The second skill set is they have to be able to transfer what they've learned to new situations. Sometimes, not every day maybe, but sometimes they need to be able to take what they learned and say, I'd like to research this topic. Could we work together and do something that's not assigned by the teacher? I'm working with a school district in Vermont. We were talking about this at the table. I was asked, because I'm from Vermont and I travel around, do I do much with Vermont? This was a high school that decided instead of taking the 2 weeks for senior midterms, most schools take that time, kids are taking all their midterms, they decided that that would be a 2-week opportunity for kids to pursue an area of interest. Because Vermont's approach to proficiency-based education is personalization. And the first question was like, so where are we going to find the time to do this? They said, well, there's that 2-week chunk of time when kids are like coming and going and teachers are sitting there correcting papers. Maybe we could do something different. So they made a shift in how they used that time. It was very successful, by the way. The third skill set is the ability to think about your learning, to reflect on your learning, and to self-regulate, monitor what you're doing. So you can do those complex tasks. A lot of kids get good grades, go to college, and drop out because they've never learned how to manage their time. Do you know anybody like that? Did you ever have kids living in your house like that? Who on Sunday night they say, Mom, do you have any cardboard and markers? And you say, why? Well, I have a project due tomorrow. And when was this assigned? A couple weeks ago, right? So this has to be built into, if I'm going to ask kids to do complex tasks, I also have to teach them the skills to manage their time. Not my timeline, like how long do you think you should need to do this piece? In other words, we have to be more collaborative as educators. We need to give a little bit of our control away to the students. Most of them rise to the occasion. So that was in 2014. We did that research synthesis. Fast forward to 2019, Gallup did a pretty extensive survey of teachers, students, and parents. And they were asking them, to what extent are we preparing students to be productive, successful employees and global citizens? And I have my PowerPoint is posted, and if you're interested in reading the report, you can go there and read that. But here are a couple interesting things that I pulled from the report. That when teachers practice student-centered techniques, allowing students to be involved with the design of some aspects of their learning, students are more self-directed. In other words, if we give them the opportunity, they will actually build it and they will come. Students were saying they'd like to do more of those things. They'd like to do more of having a choice of what they learn or how they learn, or within the structure of what you're asking them to do. But here's what the parents were saying. We use the word transfer a lot. Transfer is when you learn something and then you can do it. Near transfer is you do it the way you were taught. If I teach you how to do arithmetic, which is kind of not mathematics, arithmetic, adding, subtracting, multiplying, and you can do those problems the way I taught you, that's near transfer. I teach you how to decode words and you can sound out words. Near transfer. Far transfer is I take that learning and I can do it in a problem-solving situation. The late, great Grant Wiggins used to say, coming to school is like being on the team. You get to come to practice every day and do the drills, but you don't get to play many games. Far transfer is playing the games. There's a reason why I learned how to dribble and pass and shoot the ball. It's so I can play the game, not so I can just dribble and pass and shoot the ball. And so parents were asked how important, so they rank ordered these things. And so very low on that list were things like practicing routine skills. memorizing facts and details. What were they ranking higher? When students have a voice, when students can reflect on their own learning, when students have complex tasks, when students have choice in how they do their work, even if they make a wrong choice, they struggle through it and they learn from the mistake, as opposed to saying, don't do it that way, do it this way. You're gonna have trouble doing it that way. Sometimes kids need to struggle through making a dumb decision or a misinformed decision. They learn more from that sometimes. They need to have authentic, student-driven inquiry. They need to generate questions that they truly care about. I'm going to show you some examples of that. So we know that parents think it's important. The research thinks it's important. John Hattie, anybody heard of John Hattie? John Hattie thinks it's kind of important. In John Hattie's work, he is like I read the mother of all research synthesis, and he's rank ordered things that really produce deeper learning and faster learning, actually. The numbers, if you're not familiar with his work, if it's 0.4, that's a typical 1-year growth. So when you see 1.3, it's like 2 years growth and more. So that gives you a reference. So on the teacher side, when teachers work together and are very clear that they own all the kids in the school and they're building understanding of that in the community, it's a mindset change. When I started teaching, you kind of taught the kids in your room and you didn't really worry a lot about the kids next door. You wish that that teacher was doing something else maybe, but you didn't really work with that other teacher. Teachers being clear on what the expectations are and analyzing the tasks that they're giving kids and giving timely feedback. Those are the things that move learning forward. And on the student side, students are transferring their learning, they're using self-reflection, they're monitoring their own strategies. They're saying, I know why that didn't work, I know why this worked better. When we ask kids to do math problem solving, we want to ask them, did your approach work? How do you know that your approach worked? We don't want to just mark the answer being right or wrong. Those are the things that move learning forward and deeper. Take 30 seconds at your table and just react to some of this research. 30 seconds, go. Would anyone like to share? Would anyone like to share a thought that was shared at their table? Maybe something that resonated with you. Maybe something you feel like we're on the right track. We're sort of with that idea. Or something that's interesting that you'd like to pursue. Anyone? Thank you. Let me bring the mic, because... See, Marie made him do it.
One of the things that resonated with me, I'm a principal at an elementary school in Billings, is a collective teacher efficacy and understanding that, if you have 3 teachers in a grade level, that we're working for all of the students. It's hard not to get centered on, I'm worried about the 20 kids that are in my classroom only, and then how do we make that shift in an effective way? So I appreciate that piece.
Yes, Marie.
I just want to build off of what he just said, because when we're looking at it from an administrative perspective or a teacher perspective, we end up there, but we also had a student perspective here. And I'm looking up at student use of self-reflection. Sometimes when we work with faculty, they'll tell us things like, oh, well, I just don't have time to do that, or I don't, my students aren't motivated, or my students wouldn't be willing to do that. And we just heard at this table students say, well, actually I have a really hard time getting myself motivated to participate in some of those activities when it's not meaningful to me. And that reminds me that if we just ask the kids, talk to the kids. They can understand this, and they will tell you the truth.
Thank you. And thank you to the kid. I'll show you. I think sometimes if you have the right tools, it makes it easier to get kids to be engaged and give them the opportunities. This is a quick little review of where we were in 2012. Now, it's kind of amazing how few states were actively involved in competency-based or proficiency-based. And the darker color is up there in Maine and New Hampshire. We're sort of on the forefront. There were a few. If we go to 2017, how it changed. How many more states where something was happening. Yeah, there's Wyoming, right? What's the matter with you, Wyoming? I was working with you then. And then 2019. But, breaking news. Now Wyoming is on board. This was just last month in the paper that they're going to start a pilot project. They want to invite schools who are willing to get started on this. And that's how a lot of states and a lot of schools get started. They say, where's a few crazy people that are willing to raise their hand and say, yeah, we'll give it a shot, right? That's how a lot of good ideas get started. And sometimes their successes start to spill over. And there's a lot of research that talks about pilot projects, and then you try to scale up. Well, all the front runners, all the go-getters, they're already doing it. So you have to have a different strategy to bring everybody else along. So depending on where you are in your process, you're going to grab the smartest people who are willing to put in the work to try something and share it. And then you've got to have a new strategy. How are you going to get some other people involved? That's the collective teacher efficacy. That's getting other teachers involved in the planning. So this is where we've been. I went to that school. I sat in the desk just like those. Traditional education is designed differently. You know, we hear a lot of people say, how do we know proficiency-based will work? Well, did that work for everybody? It worked for some kids. This is kind of where we're going. Looks like chaos, right? Teachers who used to have classrooms like that would worry that the principal would come in and say, how come the kids are just like out of control? And the teacher would be thinking, they're not out of control, they're actually very engaged. And they're full of energy around what they're learning. This is where you're headed. Intrinsic motivation. Yeah, there are kids who will do something for a grade. But if they actually did something because they enjoyed learning it, wouldn't that be nice? When we do things on our own and we learn on our own, it's not because we're going to get a grade, it's because we enjoyed learning about it. So, how do you bring that joy back in but not lose the standards and some of the other things we have to worry about? Well, it can be done. The Aurora Institute is the group that has probably organized the most information around competency-based, proficiency-based learning. And they have 7 principles that they say a full-blown system should consider. Students are empowered to make important decisions about their learning. Assessment is meaningful and positive and empowering. Students get timely feedback. Students progress based on mastery when they're ready to move on. Well, we know that's really hard. You have to change some structures. It's hard to have everybody, although the reality is, on any given day, everybody's in a different place in their learning in a classroom. That's the reality. So how can we put some structures in place so that the pacing can change a little bit? Students learn actively, and there might be different pathways. Strategies to ensure equity for all students are embedded in the culture. In other words, we want to make sure that just because you're on an IEP or just because you might have language deficits or other issues going on at home, poverty, you shouldn't be locked out of the learning. In other words, we should make sure that the culture of the school supports all learners. And I think we all got into education because we wanted to do that. And then rigorous common expectations for learning exist. So a simplified version of that is this. At your table, pick one. And don't take 5 minutes to pick the one you're going to talk about because time will be up. Pick one. So let's say we're going to do number 4, we're going to do number 7, doesn't matter. And talk about, just for that one, what's a potential opportunity if you try to work on that, and what's a potential challenge if you try to work on that. 5 minutes. Have a good conversation. Maybe I'll eat a cookie. So, if you came up with more challenges than opportunities, it can be a little depressing, right? It's like, oh, this would be a problem, this would be a problem, this would be a problem. I hope you had some balance. Because there are challenges. I'm not going to say they're not challenges. Schools that have been doing this for 5 years, 7 years, they're chipping away at it. And they're bringing more people on. But it's not a quick fix. It's not something you can change instantly. So you try to figure out where is the entry point for your school. Where is the thing that you could start to move it and you'd have a critical mass working on it. I was listening in, and I guess it was this table where you were saying, yeah, it's great if kids really want to do it, but how do you get them to want to do things they don't want to do? Yeah, there are a lot of, you need other strategies for that. And I will say that choice menus, stations where kids are learning, you're creating the menu, they're picking things off the menu. You do it in little chunks at first. And working with someone is a lot more fun than working by yourself. We know the research says that when kids work on a challenging task with other kids, where there's structure and focus, they can learn faster, they can learn more, and they can go more deeply into the content than they could on their own. It's the commercial for collaboration. Kids need to learn not from you as the teacher in the room as much as they will learn from hearing 4 different perspectives on this idea before they share it with the group. So the more you can structure those things in a classroom, the more you get kids to get timely feedback from their peers. Because one teacher can't give every kid timely feedback. It just doesn't work. But if you teach them how to give feedback, and you structure that, and I'll show you a couple little ways that I've seen in classrooms, they know how to give feedback if they know what the criteria is for the expectation in this part of the task. They get very good at it. So what does it mean to be, when a student is proficient? Well, a lot of schools that are working on this say you have to start with a common vision and then build your policies and practices behind it. So you have to believe that some of these things are possible. You can't just say, here's a tool, let's see if it works. You have to start with, if we really believe that there's a way, that this is a possibility, then maybe we can figure out how to make it work. I'd like to share with you, this is a school in South Dakota, Harrisburg, South Dakota, and this is part of a webinar. I have the link if you're interested in listening to the whole thing. But he's talking a little bit about how they got their school moving forward. And I'm just going to show about 4 minutes of this clip.
We have a freshman academy and a middle school that are under construction and will open in the fall. We'll break ground when the snow melts here in South Dakota. We'll break ground on elementary number 8, and then we'll be planning for elementary 9. It'll be right along. So this idea started at the high school because of time. And you're probably asking, why did we start at the high school? We started at the high school because we had that group of teachers. We had that group of educators wanting to ask those hard questions. What if? What if we did this? What if we tried this? What if? So we gave them autonomy and we gave them time, and they started to build what is known at the high school as our customized learning environment. But the problem there was we had freshmen who came to our high school and were put in this environment without any supports. There was no rewiring of their brain for 7, 8, 9 years of their high school or their school career. They were told when the test was, what was going to be on the test, when to move from class to class, the bells. So those soft skills that you and I learned when we probably hit college, and that freshman year, first semester maybe was a little more challenging. I know for me that was. I didn't know how to manage my time. I didn't know how to advocate for my learning. I didn't know how to organize myself because I was told everything along the way. And as long as I played the game of school, I got good grades, I passed, I got my diploma at the end. So we put these freshmen in this environment where now they're in charge of their learning. They need to advocate for their learning. They need to take ownership. They need to persist, strive for accuracy, think about their thinking. And so we put them in this environment, but we didn't set them up for success. We didn't build that. And so then it got pushed down to saying, okay, what if we do this in the middle school? And so really when we look at how can we set them up for success in high school, how can we give them the soft skills, or what we like to call the essential skills, for them to be able to take that on, what does that look like? Well, the middle school said, well, wait a second, if we do this in the middle school, we're going to experience the same thing the high school experienced. So now let's look at how can we put this down into elementary? What does that look like? How can this just be part of who these kids are and how they grow as a learner throughout our system? So now we look at, okay, so in our elementary, we've said, what makes a second grader a second grader? Educators usually, typically, when I work with them, can't answer that question. Because besides them being in school for 180 days, seeing the content, we still move kids on from grade level to grade level. We just continue to pass them on. And sometimes we're not able to fill the gaps. And as they get further along in school, that's where that disengagement, when we look at the Gallup results and what does engagement look like at the different levels, that becomes part of the system, because we just keep passing them along rather than learning about who they are, supporting them, and making sure that they identify who they are.
They found what a lot of schools find is if you started at one school and you don't build it along the way. I worked with a lot of schools in Maine who had a senior capstone project, and they immediately after the first year said, well, we can't wait till kids get to be seniors to do this. Maybe we have to do something at the sophomore year to prepare them. And they kept building it back so that kids knew that something big was coming, but they did smaller versions of capstones. So that's similar to what this school district found, is that you have to, no matter where you start, it eventually has to be a system approach. They didn't do it all at the same time, though. What you also see here, these are their personalization. Those are their soft skills. So things like persistence and collaboration and cooperation. That's what that little chart is. So they had a personalization idea, an approach. And they wanted to get kids to do those things. A little further on, he talks a little bit about, he says there's a lot of places that want to start with, here's a good tool, or we'll try this structure. But he says you really have to start with the belief system. So if you picked one of those 7, he said, I believe we could maybe work on this one. Now let's talk about how do we structure our practice and what tools will help us, what resources will help us. There are a lot of schools that welcome educators to come to their schools and see how they're doing it. Not so you can replicate it, but it's to say, oh, here's another way we could consider. So there are some components of competency or proficiency-based learning. One is you have competencies. You have statements, broad statements of learning. They're bigger than a standard. The standards support the competencies, but competencies they could be academic statements about math problem solving. Students can apply their math skills to solve complex real-world problems. That might be the competency. Then there's many standards that support that competency. There's also this idea that in our book we called it personal success skills, personal skills. Sometimes it's called soft skills, adaptive skills, skills that are more cross-cutting, critical thinking across all subjects. Collaboration, communication. It's what we called the 21st century skills a few years back. Now we're thinking about it as competencies that a whole school could say, yeah, we think collaboration is important. How could we build this culture, a collaborative culture? I remember hearing a speaker once say, if you want your students to be collaborative and they never see the teachers working together, will they believe that that's what adults do if they only see adults working by themselves? So in other words, modeling these things is really important. Performance assessment. You can't have a proficiency-based system without a performance assessment, kids doing, not just paper and pencil. When I was asked to work with New Hampshire made a policy decision that they were going to have competency-based graduation requirements. So it wasn't so much about Carnegie units, it was about meeting the competencies in each course the students took. Well, they discovered soon that some competency lists were like a list of skills, and other ones were rich descriptions of learning. So they said, we're going to have to reboot this. We want some competencies that are broad statements, and you couldn't demonstrate it on a paper and pencil test. That was their rule. Like you'd have to actually be doing something to show that you met this competency. And that was our approach to create what they're called model competencies, because, you know, New Hampshire, live free or die. I'm from Vermont. We say live free or whatever. But New Hampshire is like live free or die. They're going to tell them they have to use them. But most schools are now using those model competencies because a lot of teachers contributed to thinking about them. They got feedback from across the state. And even if you tweak them a little bit, it's a lot easier than starting from scratch. And the idea was you could keep track of maybe 7 or 8 broad competency statements in a math classroom. Then you could 35 math standards. But all the standards are supporting those competencies. Then we have different pathways, and we have grading. And I'm not going to say a lot about grading, except to say, do that last. Don't start with grading if you haven't changed some other things. If you're not giving your kids performance tasks, it's kind of hard to say, we're going to change the grading system. You have to say, if we have performance assessments, how's our grading system going to change as a result of this? See, let's see the reverse. Most states, most schools start with the personal success skills, and they're called a lot of different things. Profile the graduate, profile the learner, work-study practices. I even wrote it down here because I knew I remember it. Whole child skill development competencies. Okay? So they're called different things, but they're broad and they're easy for any grade level teacher to say, yeah, I think that's important. So some of the schools I've worked with, Vermont, my state of Vermont, focused on personalization. Rhode Island has a proficiency-based graduation requirement, and one piece of it is students have to take something they care about, learn about it, get support from outside mentors, people within the school, and that's part of their graduation requirement. They call it applied learning, but every student has a personal learning plan to develop that idea. It's kind of like a senior capstone. States like Kentucky and South Carolina and others have a statewide profile of the graduate or profile of the learner. They usually are life skills that promote engagement, ownership, agency, equity. And making that shift so that students can own their learning is huge because it changes the culture. These are usually developed collaboratively within a school, outside of school. Often community members contribute ideas. Here's the challenges. How do you measure those skills? How do you scale it up? And how do you make sure that it's consistently implemented throughout the system? Here's what they look like. Oh, they don't all look the same. Do you notice that? They're very unique to the school. That's a good thing. So if we could read and blow up all of these, we'd say, well, okay, they're all saying like creative thinking is important, but they're addressing it maybe in a slightly different way. They all think collaboration is kind of important. So what I want to remind you of is you can take the competencies, the broad competencies, and make them your own and communicate them. That's the other thing that in Rhode Island they said every school had to have a communication plan. You had a way of sharing with the community what the changes are to the graduation requirements, where students are doing a capstone and they're not necessarily contributing Carnegie units, but they are meeting competencies for mathematics, for science, for language arts, and so on. Definition of personalization from the Aurora Institute, it's not the same as individualized learning. See, when I was teaching, individualized learning was every kid was doing something different. You had to try to keep track of it. That's not what this is. Personalization is, I make this important to each person in maybe the way they share their learning. Maybe this is through conferencing. I found out, I conference with students, show me from your body of work a couple of pieces of your work that show how you've grown as a learner. They pick the work. That's personal to the student. That's personalization. There's a really good article, and I put the link to this in the end of my PowerPoint, about how special education students with disabilities, the walls start to break down when you personalize learning because they can work on cooperation, collaboration, critical thinking, and there's not a stigma to who they are or what they're learning because they're personalizing the skills. Some high school special educators that recently took a webinar series with me. They're working with students, high school students with significant cognitive disabilities. These are kids who are going to go out into the world but need a lot of support. And this was their rubric for their students because they're personalizing that these students at the 1 level, they can complete tasks. So the criteria were the behavior was appropriate, their participation, they took responsibility, and they could identify what they had learned. What they were learning about is the resources available to them after they left high school. And special education teachers said a lot of parents don't know these are available, the kids don't know, they leave high school and they don't get these resources. They have to start earlier to start to learn about them and apply for them. So their performance assessment in high school was to develop a plan to access the resources that they would need. And so at the highest end, they can teach someone else. At the proficient level, they can do it independently. At 2, they can do it with support. So there's a rubric that they created to show that those kids were able to actually research these resources, decide what they would benefit from, contact those organizations even, and interview them. That's one way it looks. This was just posted on Twitter a couple days ago. Ramsey High School in New Jersey, Marie. So the post was, today 104 seniors will deliver the defense of learning. And so they're naming all the courses. So the students are doing kind of like, this is what I learned this year. This is another one from Miami. The whole class decided to create a voter's guide because there was so much arguing about what the real issues were. So they created a voter's guide for people in the community before they went to vote. It was something that was important to them. A second entry point is schools that decide to develop their competencies. This is a little bit trickier because these are going to be academic, so they're not as broad as the personalization ones. They tend to be broad goals that are tied to learning that goes beyond a lesson. They're based in the standards, organized by subject area. That's the approach that New Hampshire took. And it ends up with having fewer goals to track. Challenges, again, consistency within the system, scale up. How do you assess these? Because at the top, there's performance assessment. Integrating them with personal skills. So a lot of the work I've been doing in the last couple of years is how do you do a performance task, but you're building collaboration or self-direction, some of those skills into the content area work. How do you manage the data when kids are doing all these great tasks? This is an example where you'll notice there's an arrow that points to the standard as well as the competency. So the standard is over there on the left, and then they describe how that learning builds over time. So this is the idea of a learning progression. Some of the stuff I think Marie's been working on with schools. There's an example there. This is an example of New Hampshire, what their competencies look like. This happens to be one competency, but you'll see K2, 3, 4, 5, 8, 7, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's a competency across the top for reading literature, reading literary texts. What you see at the bottom are all the standards that support that competency. So their approach was, if we have this broad competency at K2, what are the K2 standards that support that? And then the I can statements are the learning targets, the things teachers would be teaching. Performance assessments kind of come in two flavors. Problem-based tasks, they might take a class period. That's a good way to start. There are resources out there. One is We Teach NYC, New York City, has a website, weteachnyc.org. You can look up grade level, content area, and you see performance assessments with annotated student work. I know that because I annotated a lot of that student work. There's writing activities, there's math activities, there's across the curriculum. So if you're looking for just some models, some examples, that's a good one. There are many others, but that's one. Project-based learning, a lot of schools take that approach. We're going to have a performance assessment that's going to last 2 weeks or longer. And it's not different, it's just there's more involved to get to that final product. Some of the same challenges are here. How do you grade? How do you build good tasks? How do you manage the data? Well, here's the thing. You don't average the grades. You can't average those grades, but you can give feedback as students work through the different tasks, building to the final task. So I see performance assessment as a continuum. It's not one big task, project-based learning, playing the game. If that's the end point, I've got to have some formative assessments. I've got to have a lot of formative assessments. You have to hit the ball off the tee. Then you have to learn how to hit the ball when somebody's throwing it in different ways. You also have to learn the rules of the game. You have to learn how to throw and catch. I used to coach middle school girls softball. If you couldn't catch the ball, you lost the game. As simple as that, right? You have to have scrimmages. You have to have practice to get to that big. People don't make the team and then just go to a game. They scrimmage. They practice how the game is played. They stop. They redo. They reflect on how did that go. See, that's one of the pieces that's missing in performance assessment. We have a task, and the kids don't know how to do it, and they don't even know how to get started. But if we can build a continuum, I call it a performance scale, if we can build the smaller tasks that lead up to that, most kids can do it. They might go at different pacing. Some kids may be moving a little faster, a little slower. But I spend a lot of time with the teachers that I work with. I say, first describe your performance task, now break it down. What's the least complex thing that they could do to get them started on this? And what could you build on? And where could you build from there? It's It seems logical to me. Of course, it was my idea. So management is always a thing that when you get to complex systems, management is important. And this is a group called LIFT. LIFT is somebody who read about, his wife is actually an educator, but he's a health professional and a software designer. And when they started thinking about how schools could manage the data, they created software that would help schools manage their data. And they happened to be in Vermont. I had never heard of them before. And they asked us, they had read one of our books and said, we'd like to do a webinar with you. So I said, well, could you explain what LIFT does? He did like a little demo for me. And so I want you to listen to this. This is a school in Idaho that they're working with.
So here is an interesting model developed by the Elevate Academy, which is a CTE, project-based middle and high school in Idaho, operating I think 4, maybe 5 campuses at this point. And they've really worked to codify their instructional model to support increasing levels of learner choice as well as rigor in assessment. And it's one of many models that we see emerging in the field. But this one is pretty interesting. It's connected to the work of John Hattie. You can see that cognitive conflict is normalized. So on each lesson or unit that they deliver, they first identify a bundle of standards or competencies. They explain why it matters, and then they consistently structure 4 steps of the learning process, increasing levels of rigor and depth of knowledge. So the first level is always define, then they can try to do something with that knowledge, then they can try to explain it to others, and then finally they can apply that learning to novel situations. And so this is how they introduce every single unit. And then I can show you how they break this out into assignments to maximize choice and rigor. So I'll just collapse that. They create what in LIFT is called a step. And the first step is always define. So how are they going to define research? And they offer a menu of options to the student to submit as evidence of learning. They're all targeted at just this level of the ability to define. So they'll provide a pretty robust explanation of each option, as well as what skill it's going to demonstrate. And the student can then go and submit when they feel they're ready, one or more of these assignments. And each step has what they call an assessment. It's kind of like an exit ticket. The implication being if the learner submits this assignment and it meets the criteria, they're then able to go on to the do level. So if they've moved from define to do, again, it's accompanied with a nice explanation and resources around what doing looks like, and then opportunities for practice, and then an opportunity for an assessment at the do level, simple performance task. And the student will then progress to the explain level. And again, as they codify their model, they're getting increasingly rich in their descriptions of each of these tasks and options. And eventually they'll get to the apply level. And this is where the student kind of becomes the teacher. And again, they may be given a menu of options, different ways to demonstrate their learning according to their disposition. But what's new about this step is that for each of the standards addressed, they now provide the rubric. And the rubric levels can be mastery, proficient, not yet proficient, or kind of not even started, not even dressed. So this is kind of the summative assessment of the bundle of standards or competencies that have been addressed. And teacher will just mark whatever level that they feel that the learner has achieved.
So mastery is their top level. Proficient is that third level, the explain level. So just take a minute to react. This is not software. You all have to do it this way. They talk with the school and they say, "What's your system?" And then they sort of organize the software so that they can weight the assignments. They can make some assignments count more than others. And so it compiles the data for them. So he said this was just unique to this school. Other schools do it different ways. So just process a little bit of that. You know, if you don't stop and process, you lose it. That's what good teachers have to stop and let kids talk. I'm letting you do a little processing. Who's willing to share a thought with the group? Where did those assignments come from? They were the assignments the teachers were going to give anyway. But they're now in the system. So they said, at this level, what are 4 or 5 different things kids could do? You know, I did that back in the classroom. I remember doing that. Like, I would put a packet together, and I'd say, you have to do X number of assignments, but I'm going to give you more than you have to do. I taught 2nd grade through 8th grade, and this worked. I can just say it worked with those grades. Maybe not every grade, but 2nd through 8th, it worked. Because kids would go through and be like, oh, I'm going to do, and I had easier things like a crossword puzzle to check the vocabulary on knowledge, right? But there were other things that were problem-solving tasks, other kinds of things in that packet, and they had due dates. I wasn't as organized as that, but I know that when you give kids several options and they can work with other kids, it's okay. It's okay if I sit with you and I learn with you, right? That's okay because now I've learned it. It doesn't matter who I learn it with if I learn it. And sometimes we think it's got to be independent, but it's better to do it with someone before you do it on your own. That's a good rule of thumb. Any thoughts on just anything we've seen so far that you'd like to share? You build a system like that slowly. But the first thing they did is they said, we're going to have 4 levels. This is what they're going to look like in all classrooms. Define it, do something, and that would be the near transfer. Practice it a little bit. Explain it goes a little further, and that's the proficient level. And then mastery is do something a little bit more challenging. So that's where some kids might self-select. I had kids who always wanted to go for the most challenging thing, and other ones who wanted to spend more time on the lower rungs. But at least they solidified their learning before I helped them go on. Because remember, the superintendent from South Dakota was saying, we have a system that builds gaps. We're going to go on even if you don't know it. Now we're going to go on if even more kids don't know it. Now we're going to go on again. And then we're like, oh my gosh, these kids don't know how to read. So having a management system, doesn't have to be that one, but because he was willing to explain it to me, I thought he could explain it very well. And you can kind of see it's simple, but you can go back and really look at what kids are doing. And then the teaching still happens. But some kids are doing different assignments than others. They're all working on the same standards. So you notice he said the assessments are standards-based. So complex tasks. I used to do what I call PBAs, Performance-Based Assessments 1.0. Fun activities that I would build into the curriculum. Kids liked them, and I rarely ever assessed them. Just if everybody was involved, I was happy. And then I moved into PBAs 2.0, where I started to learn about rubrics, and I learned that criteria was important, and it was embedded in the curriculum. But it was mostly me designing the task and giving kids some choices within it. Kids had to make certain decisions. There was success criteria. I even had maybe samples of student work that they could look at. A lot of people are there now. But I've come to believe there's a better way to do it, and that's when you invite kids into the design of parts of the assessment, of parts of the performance-based assessment. So it's not just the teacher, it's collaborative design. There's student voice and choice. You assess both the process, how you worked on that project. Think of the project that a kid works on and it doesn't end up very good in the end, and they get a low grade on it. I'll bet they learned something from doing that, but we never ask them, what did you learn from the process? So that's assessing the process. So I came up with this tool called STARS. STARS just stands for a real-world scenario, a task you're going to complete related to that scenario, an audience, somebody you're going to share it with, the roles and the resources that you or your group is going to take, and then some success criteria. And the success criteria is the content you have to demonstrate, the process skills you're going to use, and the product. Start there and say, what are my kids learning anyway? What is the content? What is the process they're learning anyway? Can I put that in a real-world scenario and have them fill in some of the gaps? Who would you like to share this with? What kind of a product? I will tell you that I've designed a lot of performance assessments, and this is not hard to do. So it looks something like this little table. Your real-world situation, you're going to plan an event for the class. You have to decide how you're going to earn the money for that. My 8th graders used to have a class trip. This is what they did. They decided where they wanted to go. They had to go to the school board and say, this is where we want to go. This is what we're going to learn. This is how we're going to earn the money. And then they had to plan the car washes and the pizza sales and the sub sandwich sales. I was glad I was like a lot younger then, because I don't think I could do all that now. Or it could be a design challenge, or it could be a problem, something they hear in the news. In other words, where the question marks are places where the students maybe get to choose. So you decide what the content is going to be first. This is the content. Now, how would that content work in a real-world situation? And then, where are some opportunities for some choice? So see, it's not saying, kids, for the next week, you get to do whatever you want to. No, it's like, you're going to apply your knowledge. So here's a couple examples from some teachers I've worked with. The essential question, how do authors use rhetorical strategies to communicate content of a message? This started out in the English department when they got feedback from other teachers in the school, collective teacher efficacy. The other teachers were saying, well, we want kids to be able to do that in the arts. We want them to do that in social studies, in STEM programs. So the final version, all the kids got the same prompt, which says, we've been learning about rhetorical strategies. Now you get to design an original advertisement, a speech on a debatable issue, or scientific treatise. And they build activities for whichever path the kids choose. So they're either analyzing advertisements, comparing advertisements, annotating them, designing one, getting feedback from their peers, and writing a reflection. The content that they're transferring is their understanding that rhetorical strategies are used throughout in communication. When they break down that competency, the student will analyze, like, what are the I can statements? What are the things kids have to be able to do to be successful? Well, they have to determine the author's message. They have to be able to look at a piece of media and identify the strategies. They have to evaluate the impact. They have to compare how different authors use these things. And then they effectively use them themselves. That's the steps that the students are taking. And so they built all their activities around that. Some of them were big activities, big games, and some were scrimmages. Here's how a math teacher in another school did something similar. He says, how can statistics be manipulated to sway opinions? He's got his students taking the math concepts and statistical analysis and looking for bias in how it's presented, and now they're analyzing a piece of media that uses data inappropriately. They can pick, they get to choose. Maybe they have a playlist of different articles that the teacher has selected, so there's a little built-in success. And then they write a letter to the author or to the paper, or to decide who the audience is. This is one I really wanted to have time to share with you. Oh boy, I know I'm over a few minutes. Are you okay with a few more minutes? Okay. So this is a project they do in Vermont called What's the Story? I've given you the website for that, and I actually downloaded the teaching tools, because that's what I do, because I'm a good teacher, so you steal good stuff and you share it. So I've given you the links to those things. But here the students create content based on an issue that's important to them. And this is something they work on throughout the year. They have some mentors at Middlebury College. So students from different schools can participate. So we know we have high school kids who can take like some college courses. It's that idea. But here they're building a documentary on a topic of interest. And I just want to, you can go on their website, you can see a lot of the documentaries that the kids have created are posted there, but there are a couple there that I pulled off. So here's a sample. This is locally grown. And this is a student in 11th grade who wanted to talk about locally grown food. Chris took me to a restaurant today. It was called Pharmacy, and it's farm to table. That's the idea. So this is what the student cared about. Another student, the beauty of hiking. This was actually a 10th grader, and he enjoys hiking, or she enjoys hiking, wanted to share just what that was like. A third one, this was a student who was learning about cultures in the Pacific and thought, wow, nobody in the East, the Northeast, even knows about these little indigenous cultures. And so that was a 7th grader who did her documentary on that. You can see they're very different, but the teaching is not about the content here. It's about how do you write a shooting script, how do you shoot the pieces, how do you edit it, how do you put it together as a coherent documentary. It's a very successful project, and I think any teacher who has a video camera in the school, and most do, could do a project like this. These are not long documentaries, but it's an area of interest. These kids, I believe, do it individually, but it's an easy thing that a group of kids could pick different topics of interest. So what we know that the research says is high quality project-based learning, problem-based learning is more engaging and more inclusive. It has more entry points for kids with disabilities than traditional education does. And you can go to the website if you want to read the full report on that. So quickly I'm going to show you a couple little strategies that work really well for peer feedback and self-reflection. This is a little template. And students give feedback to their peers. Remember I said you don't have to carry the shopping bags home with paper? Okay, so the 3 parts are, the rules of giving feedback are you have to be kind, you have to say something positive about what you see in the work, you have to be specific, you have to identify something that could be improved upon, and you have to be helpful. You have to make a positive suggestion of how that piece might be stronger. You also, if you notice that where that error is, you have to refer to the rubric criteria to give your feedback. You have to be kind, you have to be specific, and you have to be helpful. It's kind of a good rule of thumb, isn't it? That's a peer-to-peer. These are just little slips that maybe they pick a number and they give feedback to one person. This is called a Scrum board. In business and industry, Scrum boards help to keep track of all the different projects that are going on at one time. In a classroom, this Scrum board has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 groups of kids working. They each have a different color. They have little sticky notes that say, this is what we have to do. As they work on things, they move the sticky note to the next column. This is what we're doing. This is what we're doing right now. So as a teacher, you kind of stand back and you say, okay, I can see that first group, the pink group, I'll call them, they've got 7 tasks altogether, but they've got 3 of them in the works, and then there's a peer review. They move it to peer review when it's ready to get feedback from another group. And it doesn't go into the done pile until they've gotten feedback and maybe go back and revise it. I can, as a teacher, say, you know, there are some groups that don't seem to be moving those little sticky notes very quickly. Maybe that's the group I need to spend time with today. So it's a management tool in a classroom, and it works really well. All Scrum boards do not have the peer review column. That's important because you're building peer review into the process. You know how we say kids are working at a different pace? Those kids are working at a different pace. But maybe it's a 2-week time period when they're all going to maybe get to the finish line, but they're working at a different pace at this point in time. So it's one way. I was just working with teachers in Delaware, and they were saying, I think that we could use that for some little projects we're working on. And you can visually see, and the one recommendation from the person who wrote this article, and I have a link on my web page that's PBL, it's PBL Resources, and I have a link to his article. He says, I don't like to put the kids' names on this because people come in and out of the classroom, but the team has a name. So one is the Florida Panther. I think they're researching endangered animals, the Florida panther and the American alligator. So it's like the topics are under the team name. So you don't really know who the individual kids are, because it's not about the individual kids. It's like moving everybody forward. One other one. This is an individual one. So this is a real simple one that a school in New Hampshire uses. They have the standards they're working on, and for this one, they're working on telling time, but they're also working on counting by 2s and 10s and 5s and whatever. So those are the 2 standards up at the top of the worksheet. And the competency is applying math concepts, measurement concepts. So this is just for their telling time. They'll have other math concepts they're working on. And at the bottom level, it says they're working on the basics, and then they're making progress, and then they're demonstrating proficiency. And what the kids do is they complete tasks, and they write down that the task is done. Maybe a task number, maybe they get a signature from the teacher so they know they've met that. But the kids are documenting their own progress. Why is that important? Because the research says the motivating factors for kids to make progress. Number 3 is a supportive adult. That's you. You're number 3. Sorry, you're just number 3. Number 2 motivator is when a student identifies with a successful student. I'm as smart as she is. I worked on that with her. We did that together. We were successful. Right? When a team wins, you don't say, I won, you say, we won. So when kids start to identify with the winners in the class because they're working together and winning, that's a motivating factor. And the number 1 reason the research says the kids are motivated to improve their performance is they can see their own progress. And it's not about a number. They can actually look at their work and say, this is what I'm doing better now that I couldn't do before. So that's pretty powerful. That's a simple way. This school had everything kind of coded. So the box with the activities, the counting activities, had that same symbol on it. And the telling time activities, they were all coded with that picture of the clock. So kids could find the station they needed to go to, get what they needed to do, and this was like tracking each student. So I'm way over. Let me just decide. I think I need to just say, having kids reflect on their work, giving them prompts. I call it the chocolate chip cookie taste test. So if we were going to bake cookies, I could ask you to use accurate content. I could ask you about the content. Where'd you find the content? What knowledge are you using? I could ask you about the process. Did you follow the recipe? I could ask you about what did the cookies look like when they came out, the form of the final product. But I also want to know, did the cookies taste good? And what did you learn from making the cookies? So the idea is we need to have kids reflecting on what new ideas came from this. What did you learn about creating that documentary or solving that problem or working with your class to develop a voting guide? What connections can you make to an essential question? If you give kids, I know, I'm not here to tell you I'm going to add more time magically, but you could ask them every couple of days to write a couple sentences in a reflective journal, and at the end you would have something pretty powerful. So I'm going to end with this piece of student work. Whoops. This was a task where students, and this is from a New Hampshire school, they were reading about dystopian literature in English class. And then this was a broader assignment. Find something today that would represent a dystopian society. Research it. So the choice is, you decide what that might be. And represent it in a final product, an infographic. So in this infographic, this student chose environmental damage. You see some charts and graphs. What you don't see is there's a list of sources that the student went to. You have a definition of global warming, something about the damage that's done, the facts about it, and then the hope. That's the final product. So if you look at that product, you'd say, well, it looks like the student did some research, put it together visually very nicely. I'm going to read you the reflection because you're going to learn a lot more from the reflection than you see in this. So you see the prompts, and then you'll see I highlighted a few things. How did you determine your focus? To create my infographic, I researched my topic. I had a relatively easy topic to find information on, and it was not too hard to find hard statistics to use. I had to figure out what direction I was going with the information, be it focusing on the United States, animals, the world. I picked the rainforest for how tremendous the loss and some general facts overall. How will your infographic reflect what you learned? Once I had my facts, I had to figure out how to present them in a visually pleasing way. The layout choice is good for environmental damage because first I explained the topic, then I showed the damage, then I showed how to fix it. Environmental damage is such a serious and fast-moving issue, especially in the United States. The damage affects the future in dystopian literature. Environmental damage is almost always a main source for the beginning of the end, or the collapse of the media. People no longer have access to the truth. What insights are you starting to develop? Looking at the data of our real-world damage is frightening. The proven data about today's world and environmental damage could suggest a reason for the world to become a dystopian society, just like all the books. This is such a scary thought, and barely anyone seems to care. This is a really big theme of the United States and the world living for today and not for tomorrow. How are you drawing on and transferring your knowledge, and what decisions did you have to make? The first thing I added to my infographic is an eye-appealing graphic of the world behind the title. The reason it's green is because the central color that connects the environment is green. The background is black, symbolizing trauma, death, and havoc. From the world graphic, the title, Environmental Damage, you can really infer what this infographic will be about, and it gives a good first impression. The next thing I added was a blurb about what climate change is and how it affects the world today. I wanted to start with a little introduction so that people will have the important prior knowledge they need, very similar to an introduction paragraph in an essay. I made all of the text with information white because it contrasts well with black. The next thing I chose to add was the damage that's already been done to the world. I did this because I wanted to evoke emotional reactions, logos, right? Or pathos. Emotional, we already have the logos, the factual stuff. Reactions to the reviewers that shows the hard facts, the damage. After I show the damage, I show how to help alleviate the damage. This is good order because since viewers are already feeling bad for what has happened, this gives them motivation to do something, some of the suggested things to help. Think about what you learn from the reflection that's underlying the final product. And yet we almost always assess the final product and not the learning process. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to just share something at your table, a thought, a final thought. Maybe it's a final question. I don't know. Fill in the blank. So I hope I've sparked some thinking. I just want to leave you with this idea. It is a journey. And sometimes it feels like You're wandering around looking for, are we there yet? You're nomads, but you're nomads with a purpose, okay? You are going to do some wandering around. But if you have an idea of where the oasis is, where you want to end up, you're probably going to get there. It's not going to be quick, though. I've been working with schools for many, many years. And each year they go, oh, now I think we're ready to do this piece. And they look back on where they were a couple of years ago and they're like, I can't believe we were doing it that way back then. It's funny, it does pick up speed once you see some success, but there are some things that are hard. So, get the rock stars in your system to start trying some things. Don't try to do everything. Try to focus on something that you know you could have some success with. Thank you for being willing to sit a little longer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hess, for sharing all of that. I'm looking forward to going home and doing some reflection. And I hope you do as well.